Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and her proposed Sovereignty Act has been something that has been widely discussed over the past many days with numerous perspectives. You have the leader of Alberta's opposition, Rachel Notley, weighing in. And then, of course, you have the Alberta Premier Danielle Smith herself giving her take on the issue, on the proposed Sovereignty Act that she introduced way back now in her leadership campaign for the leadership of the United Conservative Party. And joining me now to discuss that and more is Max Fawcett. He is the lead columnist for Canada's National Observer. Max, thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me on again, Wyatt. I appreciate it.
So why don't we just start out? What's kind of all the buzz, if that makes sense, around this Alberta Sovereignty Act in Alberta?
Well, I mean, there's so much buzz. We were expecting this bill to be controversial. You know, this was the proposed idea of pushing back against Ottawa, of asserting jurisdiction, of potentially even resisting federal laws if the government felt they encroached on Alberta's rights and jurisdiction. We all knew that this was going to be a big deal. What caught everyone by surprise is there was a provision in Bill 1, Bill 1 being the first and most important piece of legislation for any new government, and this is a new government with the new premier. There's provision in Danielle Smith's Bill 1 that essentially allows cabinet, once a motion is passed in the legislature saying the federal government has done something that encroaches on Alberta's freedom, and they vote on it, the cabinet essentially has what are known as Henry VIII powers, which are these extraordinary legal and political powers that allow them to change legislation without going back to the legislature, without having MLAs vote on it. These are the sorts of emergency powers that are usually reserved for wars. The Alberta government brought them forward in a different bill during COVID on the concern that people wouldn't be able to gather in the legislature and actually vote. They never used it, but they put those powers in place. So this is extraordinary power being given to a government, essentially because Ottawa is mean to it, in their view, or that the crisis is that Ottawa is not being fair to Alberta. It really caught a lot of people by surprise. And so you've had constitutional scholars pretty much up and down the line come out and say that this is very out of line. Emmett McFarlane, who teaches at Waterloo, said that it was the most unconstitutional piece of legislation in modern history in Canada. So it really is quite something. We were expecting the Sovereignty Act to be controversial, and it has managed to exceed our expectations probably tenfold.
And when we look at the relationship between Alberta and the federal government back in October now, I asked the Prime Minister about this, and he didn't say too much as it relates to the relationship between Alberta and how that might change under Premier Smith. But I think it's fair to say that now that relationship is quite tense, I guess you could say, with this Alberta Sovereignty Act. How do you foresee the relationship between the feds and Alberta potentially changing under this so-called act?
Well, it'll be a real test for the Prime Minister, because this is bait. This is clearly an attempt to create a conflict with Ottawa, to get the Prime Minister to, whether it's using the very rarely used federal power of disallowance, which essentially allows Ottawa to cancel legislation or remove legislation passed by a province. I mean, we haven't seen that in decades. This is an attempt to bait the Prime Minister into an attack or into a fight with Alberta, because there's a lot of tough things going on right now. Danielle Smith is not popular with Albertans. The UCP is not popular with Albertans. The healthcare system, like in many provinces, is at a breaking point. There's a lot of ways they can lose the next election, but one way that they can probably win it is by getting into a big fight with Ottawa. That has never played poorly here. It is a very familiar strategy, and she's clearly trying to get him to engage on that level. The test for him, and so far I think he's passed it with flying colors, has been to not go for it. He's sort of said, no, I'm focused on helping Albertans with cost of living things. I'm helping grow the economy. I'm not interested in getting into a fight over the Constitution with Danielle Smith. And I think he has to maintain that posture because we saw the other day Rachel Notley slipped up and gave a statement where it wasn't clear if she was referring to the federal government repealing the Sovereignty Act or the Alberta government. She quickly clarified that it was the Alberta government, but Danielle Smith and her colleagues have made a big deal out of it. They've issued press releases saying, Rachel Notley is turning to Ottawa to overrule legislation she doesn't like. They're clearly wanting this fight, and it is incumbent, I think, on the Prime Minister and on Rachel Notley to keep things focused on what really matters to people here, which is fixing the healthcare system, dealing with cost of living issues, and generally kind of getting through this last phase of COVID.
And looking at some of the most recent news out of the Alberta legislature, of course, Jason Kenney resigned yesterday as an MLA for his riding that he had represented during his time as premier, and then for the few weeks that Danielle Smith had been premier, he represented the riding as well. When you look at how that relationship has changed between Danielle Smith and Jason Kenney, and just between kind of those two people in general, Jason Kenney and Danielle Smith, what do you see as some of the biggest differences there? I mean, a lot of political observers would agree that the relationship between Jason Kenney and the federal government was tense, but how much more tense do you foresee it being under Danielle Smith?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of us back when Jason Kenney was premier thought, well, it can't get much worse than this. And oh, how we were wrong, because it is definitely worse. It's interesting. Jason Kenney in his resignation letter tried to really kind of retcon history a little bit and pretend that he was a centrist, that he was a man of institutions and the rule of law, and he's dismayed to see this sort of degradation of our politics and this rise of populism. And let's be clear, he created this. He spent all of his time from the moment he was elected trying to pick fights with Ottawa, whether it was the equalization referendum, whether it was creating the war room, public inquiries into foreign funding of oil and gas. It was all trying to whip up this sort of populist anger, which ultimately came back and bit him in the bottom. That this is the challenge with creating populist anger, is that sometimes you can't control it, and sometimes it goes in directions you can't foresee. So he is trying to create a legacy for himself here that sets him apart from Danielle Smith. I think that is a little bit dishonest on his part, but in fairness, he is still and was still operating within the institutions in our country. He was holding referendums. He was holding inquiries. He was doing things, I think, pushing at the edges of what is fair and allowable. But he was within those boundaries. With the Sovereignty Act, Danielle Smith is proposing to go well outside any sort of reasonable norm that we've seen in the last 50 years in Canadian politics. And he, to his credit, he was calling it out throughout the leadership race. He was on his radio show saying that the Sovereignty Act idea was nutty. He used a whole bunch of different mean words for it, meaner than most people, and really tried to point out the fact that this was not a good way to move forward. It would not help the province attract business. It would scare off investment. And I do think he'll be proven right, but he doesn't get to wash his hands of the monster that he helped create here, because in many respects, Danielle Smith is the logical extension of the politics that he brought to Alberta when he came here in his blue truck back in 2017.
Is this the last we'll see of Jason Kenney?
I don't think so. I know political people, and I'm probably guilty of being one myself, and you don't get this stuff out of your blood. It's there for life. And so I think he will stay in the game. He will, maybe he goes to work for a think tank. Maybe he goes and spends a few years in the private sector. I wouldn't at all see him be surprised to see him, let's say Pierre Poilievre wins the next election. Maybe Jason Kenney is appointed to represent Canada at the Vatican, or be the the ambassador to Great Britain. There's a lot of quasi political roles or politics adjacent roles that I think he would be very happy in. So no, I don't think we've seen the last of him. I don't think he's going to fade into the background. You know, if you're as political and as invested in the country as he is, this stuff, it doesn't quit you, and you can't really quit it. So, you know, I will credit to Jason Kenney. You know, this has been his life from the moment he got into politics at a very young age, and I just can't imagine him being able to walk away from it.